Yeah, that's Bisharo. She is a very close friend, so I pick on her a lot. So you could see that we're really easy with each other. All right, so here we go. How to get the most of your religion is what I was actually asked to talk about. And of course, when we're talking about this topic, it's a very sensitive topic because at many times what we don't I would say keep in mind is that when we're speaking about religion, we usually just think about only spirituality. And that's really problematic because there are a number of different parameters and scopes of religion that we have to understand in order to get the best out of it. In other words, whenever you're looking at a matter before you recognize what you want out of it, you really have to understand what is in it. What am I trying to get to by actually practicing the religion? And especially during our times today, in where religion is, I would say, the materialism that we're living in where it's confining religion within spirituality, or within, let me call it in terms of a place, confining religion that it's only to be limited within a masjid or within a spiritual relationship, and should not exceed in any other dynamic, or should not exceed in any other scope. And that's actually problematic because it also affected the Muslim mindset without us recognizing, in where we also have confined religion that it's only within a parameter where it's relating to a spiritual moment and should not exceed that. Well, when we're talking about religion in Islam, it actually goes farther than that, because it actually affects it affects the foundation of your relationship. So it affects the aqidah. It affects, how do I actually view myself? How do I view Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why is that even the center? And how do I actually work on understanding that center? The second part is working on the action. So we're looking at, if you were to look at the parameters, so we're talking about mind, we're talking about actions right there, and then we're talking about the soul. And that's really the whole human being. So when we're looking at a person, we're not just talking about just an action. If you look at the secular understanding today, the secular understanding is all focused on, how you relate when it comes to spirituality. It's really confined to, yes, a moment of yoga or a moment of spiritual relationship, and then outside of that parameter, that it's not supposed to be related to anything. And when we actually speak about actions, it's basically in the materialistic secular lifestyle, in where actions are really regulated by law, and that law is separate from religion. And that becomes a very dangerous thing, because when we think of law, it shouldn't be confined whatsoever to thinking that law is just a matter of regulating people's lives. But law in Islam, it actually relates to even your heart and even to your spirituality. So what you look at, what you talk about, all these different things, they actually act as those areas that will actually affect your heart and affect your lens of view even. So that's why when we look at these sides, it's really important to understand, well, what do we mean by religion? It's definitely a larger scope than confining it into the secular, comparing it to the secular perspective. It actually has a larger scope in where it affects the mind, affects the actions, and certainly affects even the core of who you are. So in other words, since we actually talked about, okay, looking at the core in where it's affecting the lens of our view and affecting how we understand the world around us, how do we actually work on protecting our aqidah? What is aqidah? So aqidah acts as the center of how you view things. The aqidah is really your creed in how you understand who you are, what you are, why you were created, and the idea of the essence preceding existence is actually the core of Islam, in where your essence, the purpose of your life, actually preceded your own existence, and that you would actually think of that purpose that preceded your existence and not create or invent an essence, but you live the essence that preceded your existence. Right. Now, this is extremely important because when we actually talk about, well, how do we build and protect our aqidah? How do we build and protect our aqidah is extremely important because it actually starts when we actually think of the part where, well, in order to know what it means to build our aqidah, we first have to understand why is that even important? Well, that's important because even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that when we're talking about hidayat irshad, what is hidayat irshad? There's a difference between hidayat irshad and hidayat tawfiq. What is that? So when we look at the prophets and the messengers, yes, they are guiders, but there's one thing, is that why weren't the prophets able to guide everyone? Because certain people, they actually lacked hidayat tawfiq. They actually lacked the part in where what and how to get to that point, which is how to find the guidance. And one very important course, when the person's center is lost, think of it as a compass that's totally gone. So in other words, if the person is trying to find a place, if they don't know what destination to get to, they're just going to keep on turning in circles. So that's why the map is there. But not finding the place, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means you just happen not to find the place because you don't have the map to get to the place. And this is something very often that teenagers would many times, and just pay attention to this one. And oftentimes they would say, well, you don't understand me. You don't understand what I'm talking about. You don't know how it feels, etc. And forgetting that, hey, I was a teenager too. So I definitely know how it feels. But why are they constantly using that one? It's really because with their ta'alluq, with their connection to the dunya, they would actually think that there's an area that they want to get to, and that once they get there, they will reach the ultimate happiness. It's not just a teenager, but it's also many that would live like that, in where they would be walking and going after a mirage that's not actually there. In other words, it's not that they are lost per se, but it's that they're lost in something that does not even exist. I'm looking for something that doesn't exist. And that's the same thing, in where oftentimes as human beings, we can actually be running after a mirage, thinking that there's that happiness. If I were to get this piece of dunya, if I were to get a phone, if I were to get married, if I were to get a house, if I were to get this money, if I were to get such and such and such, we would actually be running after a mirage, thinking that the ultimate happiness is there. And that's why many times we could see during our times, especially where with the rise of depression, it's usually because people are actually in search of something that doesn't actually exist. What is what exists? It's really the purpose of life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us that hidayat irshad, in where he gave us and sent us that those areas to guide you to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the purpose. The purpose is to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All the other things are actually tools, house and home and all these different things, they're actually tools. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would guide us through those areas in order for us to recognize that you can really, with money, you can buy a house, but you can't buy a home. You can probably get, with your beauty, maybe get a good, maybe get a husband, but not necessarily a soulmate. You can probably get different luxury, maybe a good bed, etc., but you can't necessarily buy sleep. You can get food, not get appetite, and the list goes on and on. When we're looking at that, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was always telling us, well, what your purpose is supposed to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the purpose. The purpose is to get to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُؤْمِن بِاللَّهِ يَهْدِ قَلْبَهُ. Whoever believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he will find guidance. Why? Because the guidance is to actually find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not dunya. Because when you're actually searching for dunya, those things are just tools to get you some level of getting some level of satisfaction, but that's not the ultimate satisfaction. And that's why you will find many in search of the ultimate satisfaction, but it's not there. And they'll continue searching, whether from younger or older. They're looking for something that doesn't exist. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, well, you need to recognize the center of what you're really looking for is really La ilaha illallah. That's the center. The center is once you find your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and once you recognize who is Allah, you recognize then, what is my relationship to Allah? The relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not worship because He gave us the bounties, but the relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to worship Him because He is Allah. What does that mean? So what that means is that the word Allah actually comes from the compound words. It's al-ilah, the God. But the word God to mean deity is actually deity is actually to mean, the word ilah is actually to mean the one that people worship. So if it's the God, the one that people worship, does worship come first or does worship come later? In other words, do we worship Allah because He gave us the bounties, or do we worship Him because He deserves to be worshipped before even getting the bounties? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserves to be worshipped before even getting the bounties. Why? Because the second, if you think that by getting the bounties, that's what's making worship incumbent upon you to be for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then does that mean that by losing these bounties, that the right of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is gone? Does that mean it's gone? Once it's gone? No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserves to be worshipped because He is the center of your own existence. He is the center of the whole world. The Lord Almighty deserves to be worshipped because everything anyways belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, worship is actually a center for you as well. Because without this connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you yourself are lost. Why? Because remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the center. And once you're lost from the center, what does it mean to connect to the center? What it means to connect to the center actually means to stay in worship, to stay on the right path of the center. So how do we relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You recognize Allah Almighty in every single corner of the path that you're actually walking in. Recognize Allah, that He is not only the God, but He's actually Al-Awwal. He's the beginning. He's the last. He's beyond. The Lord Almighty is the creator, not the creature. You recognize these points in order for you to recognize that your weakness depends on the Lord Almighty's strength. Your illness depends on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name being Ash-Shafi, the one to give cure. Your poverty depends on Allah Almighty being Ar-Razzaq. Your creation depends on Allah Almighty being the creator. Now, you won't be able to recognize yourself unless you recognize Allah Almighty. At the same time, by recognizing the Lord Almighty, you are recognizing yourself. So you live in that constant realization of who you are, where you're going, and what you are. So that's why when we're actually talking about Tawheed, it's actually connecting you with Allah Almighty by recognizing every single moment. You're bringing in the light to that recognition through dhikr. So what we're trying to get to when we're speaking about deen, you're trying to get to manifesting and enhancing the relationship between you and what you were created for, and the path that you're trying to take. You're enhancing the relationship. You're bringing a realization about yourself all the time so that you will not get lost off track. What track? The essence that was actually there, determined before your own existence. Determined before your own existence. So you take that recognition. So how do I actually build that piece of it? You build that piece of it by actually connecting it with the Prophet himself, in where you're connecting it to living like the Prophet, peace be upon him. And therefore, you're actually connecting it with وَاتَّبِعُوهُ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَهْتَدُونَ, and follow him in order for you to get to the guidance. Who? Follow the Prophet, peace be upon him, to actually find the guidance. So therefore, when you're looking at your understanding of the world, there are three different types of understanding. There's an understanding in where it is related and beginning from the empirical knowledge, experience, experiment. This is the side that our cognitive skills have managed to find. But that's not the only source of knowledge, because that source of knowledge can be many times manipulated through narrative. We find that many times in where there could be a study, but how do we read the study? How do we make up the study, especially in regards to humanities? How do we understand the study? That brings in a narrative, which of course cannot necessarily be 100% subjective. Now, the other part in where we can understand and learn about the world through our own feelings. Our own feelings can sometimes also be manipulating. They can manipulate us in many ways. We can feel that we love something and think that that is good for us simply because we love it, simply because it brings us pleasure, simply because we may find sadness in something. We may actually think and get manipulated that because it's bringing me some type of sadness, therefore I should ignore it and I should be away from it because it doesn't give me the feeling of happiness. It doesn't give me the endorphins that I'm looking for. So therefore, I should avoid it. A very big manipulation that we may not recognize. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us right there that in the end is that you want to follow al-wahi. What is al-wahi? Al-wahi actually means the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent onto Jibreel alayhi salam. Why? Because if you were to actually follow your feelings or your pleasures as your source of information, you can be manipulating yourself without you recognizing. If you were to follow your rational thinking / studies and what many times science can be bringing you forward, you may not recognize that studies themselves actually contain a lot of flaws and a lot of research that has probably gone wrong. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that they would actually follow speculation, or they would also follow il-hawa, their own pleasures or their own inclination. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, in order to actually build your aqidah, your own true understanding, in where you want to make sure that the center of your knowledge, that you're recognizing the world around you based on solid basis, that it has to first start with al-wahi. Because all the different tools of trying to figure things out actually contain flaws within them and can actually be manipulating and are not necessarily 100% subjective. Without you recognizing, there's a lot of narrative that is definitely infiltrating our own decision-making and how we actually read these studies or read these feelings. And without us recognizing, we're actually falling in a ball of manipulation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to actually start with al-wahi. Al-wahi, to actually start with the circle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you can be manipulating yourself without you recognizing. So what are the guidance the different guidances in the different forms. Well, the different forms of guidance, you've got hidayat irshad and hidayat tawfiq. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you guidance, but it is you that decides on whether you want to find the guidance and whether you want to take it or not. Guidance is there. The path is there. The destination is there, but it's really dependent on you whether you want to take it or not. In other words, what can manipulate me and what can harm my ability to judge finding the guidance? That's the scary thing. So are we asked to ignore our rational power in order to find guidance? Are we asked to ignore our feelings in order to find guidance? The answer is absolutely not. In fact, even the Quran is actually telling you to use those tools to find guidance. But the Quran is also telling you, beware and make sure you're using different tools to make sure that your mind is not contaminated with the wrong contaminations and contaminated to the point that it might actually get you off the track into making your mind think properly. And that's why the Quran will actually tell you, careful, there are these actions that can be contaminators. Spiritual contaminators can actually act as contaminators to contaminate even your ability to process the ideas that surround you. Spiritual contaminators go beyond than spiritual contaminators to actually affect your ability to process ideas that surround you, or even your ability to even process feelings that surround you. Now, this is extremely important because according to Islam, when we look at spiritual contaminators, they're not just spiritual contaminators that just basically are confined. Now we're going back to what we started out in the beginning of the class, in where spiritual contaminators are not to be confined within a place called a masjid or a place called religion. Spiritual contaminators go beyond spirituality to the point that they actually affect your ability to process ideas and your ability to process feelings. Because as human beings, we actually use these different tools to understand the world around us, whether that is rationality / studies in science, or two, our different feelings. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, and that's what we actually wanted to start with in the beginning of the class, in where spirituality is not whatsoever to be confined as this is just related to religion. Because in Islam, it tells you no. It actually starts with one, your processing ideas actually should start with one, what we regard as containing what is factual, which is, it starts with Allah Almighty. If your understanding of the world does not actually start with La ilaha illallah, then certainly your perspective, your observation, your understanding of the world around you is certainly going to be affected and influenced by one, different narratives that you thought were subjective, but actually are objective. You thought that they were actually being pure and just thinking about the situation, when in reality, it was really influenced by a lot of different factors that actually affected your vision on things. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, ilm actually starts with wahi. Ilm starts with recognizing your Lord Almighty. Ilm actually starts with you clearing out the different contaminations, even on spirituality. That's your way to clear your vision / mind / rationality, and your way to clear your understanding and how you relate with the world in terms of feelings or in terms of how you relate with the world around you. So when you look at all these different sides, well, how do we actually personify, or how do we actually put that into something that I can sense and I could feel? I got the idea, but how do I actually live that where I could feel it, I could sense it, I can understand what it looks like on ground in practice? Can you give me a practical idea of how I could understand it. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually sent the Prophet ﷺ in order to actually see that in a form of a person. And that is the Prophet ﷺ. So in other words, to live the idea of wahi is to actually relate to knowing the Prophet himself, whether knowing the history, knowing how he actually lived that life of what it means to live the wahi. And that's why Sayyida Aysha, when she was asked about the Prophet ﷺ, she said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ. She said, his morals were the Quran in practice. His morals were actually the Quran in practice. What did she mean to say? She meant to say that the Quran was actually personified in the Prophet ﷺ in order for us to feel it, in order for it to sense it. And that's why when we actually talk about the Prophet ﷺ, in order for us to look at what does it mean to actually live Islam, what are we trying to get of the religion? We're actually trying to get the religion in how we actually live our life, feel our life, feel of what we are, and at the same time, really live a life where we understand ourselves and understand where we're heading. That way, we won't actually go into a life in search of something that doesn't exist, and then go into different circles, and then get lost, and then go into depression, thinking that everybody else has it, but I don't. The money, the luxury, all the different things that you have don't necessarily mean you have what is the essence of what you were looking for. Like we said, you can have a bed, but not sleep. You can have a car, but not necessarily get to living the road and living this and getting that transportation, all those different things. There are certain things that you cannot necessarily get just by having the materialistic side. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was all about how to, okay. Now that I feel like I'm in an airport. Seriously, I feel like I'm in the airport. So, right? Mm-hmm. How do we relate to the Prophet ﷺ? Well, in order to relate to the Prophet ﷺ, there's no way that you can relate to anybody unless you know about their life. Unless you know about their life, unless you know what they had said, unless you know what they actually look like. In every single corner, you relate to the person when you know the person. So to know the seerah is not just knowing a story. It's to learn how can I live the words in light. It's to relate. The words in light actually brings love. There's no way that you can love somebody unless you know them. I can tell you about X, Y, or Z, but to actually feel them, to actually hear about them is totally different than when you actually imagine them all the time. You know what they do in each and every single corner. When you know His mercy, you will love His mercy, and you will love Allah's mercy, because you would know that I could see the mercy of Allah Almighty by looking at the mercy of a prophet or messenger. I could see the love. I could see the khashya. I could see the beauty. I could see all that. That's the only time when you could actually love to want to be like the Prophet ﷺ. So learning about his life by studying Quran, studying Hadith, or studying Seerah actually brings in a different connection. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلْيَحْذَرِ الَّذِينَ يُخَالِفُونَ عَنْ أَمْرِهِ أَن تُصِيبَهُمْ فِتْنَةٌ. Why do I need to relate? Well, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you got to be careful. Because the second that you step off and away from the path of the Prophet, you got to be careful. Because you might actually, one, come across a fitna, or adhabun alim. Adhabun alim on Judgment Day, a punishment. But what is the fitna? A fitna is a manipulation. Why did I actually say manipulation now? Well, that's because remember, yes, I understand I need to go to Allah Almighty, but what is the compass that takes me to Allah Almighty? That's what a prophet is supposed to be doing. It's how do I get to Allah? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, be careful, because the second that you step off the path, you will be stepping yourself into a zone of manipulation. And that's what fitna is. It's a stone of manipulation. It's a zone of manipulation. It's a zone where you think you know where you're going. Because guess what? Once you lose your GPS, then you're going to start depending on your own calculation, your rational mind, or your own feelings. And once you depend on your own mind and your own feelings, there's a very high chance that you might actually get lost, because your own calculation can carry a lot of flaws within it. And especially if we're talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because your own calculation cannot necessarily get you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually beyond your physics. Your calculation, your rational mind was actually given the scope to calculate physics, to calculate matters that are physical around you, things that you can sense. But the Lord Almighty is beyond nature. What does that mean? Metaphysics? Well, yes, that's one side. But the Lord Almighty is beyond your natural calculation. The Lord Almighty, what you can find through your mind, is an understanding that this world cannot be created on its own. That's what science can prove to you. But is there any way that science / our mind can in any way at any time actually bring a calculation to how old God is or where he is? Is there any way that we can find God on an MRI or some kind of a scan? The answer is no. Because what science can detect is really what we told it, what we managed to detect through our mind, or what we managed to make our minds be able to investigate, which are the materialistic things. But the Lord Almighty is beyond physics. The Lord Almighty is beyond physics. He's beyond what our mind can calculate. Therefore, you cannot necessarily depend on your mind to find God. And that's why you needed wahi, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually sent the prophets and the messengers, because your mind cannot get to finding God. Your mind can only get to you understanding that this world is far more complex to be created on its own. End of the story of what your mind can calculate. And end of the story of what your mind can get to. But will your mind actually be able to get to God and what God is? You're going to get a lot of discrepancies because your mind is going to be confused. How do I understand evil? How do I understand the world around me? How do I understand illnesses? How do I understand all these different things? You're going to find a lot of different things that might seem very contradictory. How do I understand all the paradox that surrounds me? And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually sent the prophets and the messengers to help us understand what our mind is not capable of finding. Al-Wahi was there in order to help us. But just like we said, in where, yes, the prophet and the messenger was supposed to help us find at least the idea that our mind is incapable of getting to the complete truth. But even that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually sent us the information that even our actions can actually also be the cause of a deficiency in our own mind, in the deficiency of our own ability to understand the world around us. So our actions can actually make our minds incapable of viewing things? The answer is absolutely. And which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was many ayat focusing, even Qawm Lut. Why wasn't it, when we're looking at Qawm Lut, for example, why didn't it actually start with telling Qawm Lut to actually worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly? You could see that in the story of Qawm Lut, there wasn't an emphasis on idolatry, idol worship, or any form of worshiping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the focus was actually on a particular behavior. Even though clearly in the other stories, there was a lot of focus on whether Prophet Musa alayhi salam, on the injustice that was there, on the use of let's call it the extravagant use of authority and where to commit injustices, whether political, economical, social injustices. All these different things were clearly seen in the story of Musa alayhi salam. But the behavior in the different stories, and whether Prophet Musa alayhi salam or Prophet Lut, there was an emphasis also on behavior in how it affects our ability to process our connection with God, how it affects our ability to build a connection with the Lord Almighty. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was always focusing on the idea that your actions and what affects your actions are a number of different things. Number one, who is your icon? Why is that even mentioned to be as part of the action? We're going to get to it. What are the characteristics of the person that you want to be? Are the people / the environment that you surround yourself with parallel to what you wish to be and what you want to be as what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to be? Now, the thing is that when you actually look at these questions, you might think, how's that even related to action? Because our actions usually are actually affected by who we take as an example. And our actions, without us recognizing, our actions are actually affected by, number one, it's that the society that surrounds us, that we absorb as human beings, we actually absorb a certain recognition of what is right and what is wrong based on compliment. So we see the society is complimenting a certain behavior. Our mind processes the idea that this is good. And then we take it as acceptable. And it becomes, there's going to be this certain figure that's going to be the example that we will take as he or she is the evidence of their success, to mean that something is actually going to be leading to a very advanced or type of success that we would usually personify. So we would think of richness, maybe a particular rich figure, and we would say, well, we have to replicate their life in order to get to this type of richness. Education, we have to replicate that education to get to that their path, etc. And then the stories become the icons in where we want to live like. The compliment that we get. And that's a dangerous part that we're living in today, in where when we're looking at teenagers, for example, in the society in where social media is actually creating a new social currency in where you get a certain compliment, and that this compliment is actually complimenting on probably a behavior that is not decent. And then they will find many complimenting this behavior, and then eventually they would think by that compliment that this behavior should be acceptable, even though it was just a gaming or probably going on a cliff to take a dangerous picture. But hey, I got the compliment and my photo got viral. My comment got viral. Therefore, it got the compliment. Therefore, I'm doing the right thing. And when we're looking at the icons and when we're looking at the different environment, this is just for us to understand one very important thing is that most of our actions actually came to be by the different people that surround us. Our actions came to be where they're at right now by the environment that we surround ourselves with. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was always, through the Prophet ﷺ, and of course in the ayat, always emphasizing that, listen, look at all the previous nations. The story is always, how did you come to a realization that what you're doing is right? And they would always say, well, we have a long legacy of that. Our ancestors were doing this, or the society is doing this. And that's why environment actually happens to be one of the most dangerous fitan, manipulators that surround us. Environment is actually one of the most dangerous tools, where the Quran is constantly telling us, be careful of the environment. But here's the thing. If the environment is such a dangerous tool, why whatsoever are we actually supposed to be at odds with it all the time? We're not saying to be odds with it, but the Quran is telling you, you need to be aware of what that environment carries, because you can be yourself manipulated without you recognizing. So you need the Quran and the Sunnah to recognize it. So how do I begin? Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. You imitate any group of people, then you are part of them. So the Quran is telling you, wake up. The Prophet ﷺ is telling you, wake up. Don't imitate a group of people simply because they happen to be doing a certain behavior. Take a moment to rethink, who am I part of? What am I part of? Who do I want to be part of? Why is that even important? Who do I want to be part of? What am I part of? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to think that moment, that without you recognizing who you want to be part of is really that subliminal and subconscious piece of you that will affect who you want to take as your icon. And it's that subconscious side that's affecting your behavior. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, Muhammadur Rasulullah. Muhammadur Rasulullah والذين معه أشداء على الكفار or تراهم ركعا سجدا, sorry. رحماء بينهم تراهم ركعا سجدا. So he said, Muhammadur Rasulullah. Muhammad, the Prophet of Allah, and those that were with him. Why did he even mention them? Well, he wanted to mention them in order for the generations to come after to actually recognize who they should be taking as an icon. So he actually related it to their action, to their behavior, and he said, أشداء على الكفار. They're actually mighty against the disbelievers. Why did he start with the mighty and not the mercy? Because there's no way that you can just love. I have to hate? Absolutely. There's no way that you could love justice without hating oppression. You can't just talk about love and loving justice without hating oppression. To love justice actually means to hate oppression. It goes with it. And that's the same thing. To love the believers actually means to have a distance or hate the life of the disbelievers. To love faith actually means to hate kufr. To love Allah actually means to hate shaitan. There's no way. Why? Because Islam is telling you, you can't live with a ball of discrepancies within yourself. When you live your identity, you have to be in full awareness of your identity. Relativism in your life is going to create a ball of fluidity, and a ball of fluidity has no borders. And the second you don't have borders in your identity, that means you are borderless. In other words, you have no shape. When is something with no shape? When is something with no shape? When it has no borders. In order to have a shape, you have to have borders. You're an artist, right? I guess so. All right. And that's why when you actually look at that ayah, that they're actually merciful between each other. In other words, what? Creating a bond. Now let's see, what bond are we talking about? We're looking at different orbits. Remember the atom? You've got on the inside, you've got the nucleus. And then you've got the first orbit, then the second orbit. And guess what? The first orbit can only take 2. The second orbit can only take 4 or 8. And the list goes on and on. There are certain orbits you cannot put more electrons on them. They can only take limited electrons. The nucleus is the Lord Almighty. That's it. And that should act as the gravity. And the farther that orbit, in the second orbit, it's only supposed to be the messenger, the salihin. The third orbit, you got your parents. Third, fourth orbit, etc. The number, your children, etc. But there's certain orbits, you cannot confuse these orbits. But even, look at this one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he tells us a story of Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, tells us a story in Surah Yunus. And while the story goes and tells us about Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, and he says that the waves were going higher and higher like mountains. And then Prophet Nuh alayhi salam was calling on to his child. Ya bunayya arkam ma'ana. Oh son, go on the ark with us. And then he said, Sa'awi ila jabali ya'simuni min al-ma'. I'll go on a mountain that will protect me from the waves and their attack. Prophet Nuh alayhi salam tries again and again with a bigger attempt. There's no way that anything can protect you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ayah continues and giving us a different angle of that camera and says, وَحَالَ بَيْنَهُمَا الْمَوْجِ فَكَانَ مِنَ الْمُغْرَقِينَ. The wave then was so high, a huge wave, then comes into the scene and it becomes the barrier. Now, Prophet Nuh alayhi salam couldn't talk to his son anymore. The wave was too big. It basically made a barrier. And then the ayah continues, فَكَانَ مِنَ الْمُغْرَقِينَ. This is the story, the other camera coming in. Now the other camera bringing in what happened to Nuh after that. Prophet Nuh alayhi salam cries out to the Lord Almighty and says, O Lord, inna bini min ahli. O Lord, my son, he's part of my family. What did he want to say? Is there any possibility that I can intercede in this and anything? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إني أعظك أن تكون من الجاهلين. نوح إنه ليس من أهلك. Nuh, he's not part of your family. Why? إنه عمل غير صالح. What he did was an action that wasn't pious. What did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want to tell him? He told him, إني أعظك أن تكون من الجاهلين. I warn you from being amongst those jahilin. What is a jahil? Ladies, pay attention to this one. Al-jahil was a person that confused the orbits. What orbit? The orbit in where the relationship was supposed to be, that the center was the Lord Almighty. In where this gravity, look at it as a gravity, in where the Lord Almighty is that gravity. In other words, the person that goes outside of the orbit that is based on Allah Almighty is outside of your orbit. does not belong in that orbit. And therefore, when you look at the center of your relationship, it should always be La ilaha illallah. That's the center of your orbit. And that's why when you want to get married, look for a person in where his orbit is La ilaha illallah. When you want to be friends with somebody, look at the orbit. Are they within the orbit of La ilaha illallah? When you want to raise your children, the orbit should be not what degree and how much money they'll be making, but their orbit should be La ilaha illallah. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling him, Inni a'idhuka an takuna min al-jahilin. Don't confuse the orbits. And that's why he told him, he's not even part of your family. Why? Because he wanted to tell him that family relations is not based on blood. It's based on La ilaha illallah. Friendship is based on La ilaha illallah. The dynamics of who you actually make and surround, the social dynamics, all of that, La ilaha illallah. So what does the religion create within you? It creates within you an observance of how you recognize the Lord Almighty beyond the materialistic world, where you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only in his magnificence in the world around you, but only Allah Almighty to be the one to bring about how I make my own social connection, financial connection, and the world that surrounds me is based on the love for Allah Almighty. So then when that actually comes in, then you recognize that the world around you, the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-mar'u ala dini khalileh, falyanzur ahadukum man yukhalil. Your religion is based on the religion of your friend. Your piety is actually based on the piety of your friend. So make sure when you make a friend, when you create a social gathering, make sure it's based on the religion. La ilaha illallah. And that's why Al-Khattabi, where's the Afghani sister that would always come? Where's she?
She's not here.
We're going to miss her because we're actually going to quote a very important Afghan scholar, and his name is Al-Khattabi. He's originally from Afghanistan. And he says, don't be a friend. لا تخالل إلا من رضيت دينه وأمانته. He said, don't be a friend, but to a person that you would approve. You approve? No, Allah approves, but you would recognize that they have the good piety, that they are trustworthy, because know that whoever you are friends to is going to affect your piety, is going to affect, at the end of the day, going to affect how you relate with the orbit, with the nucleus, it will affect where you at, even where you at yourself within the orbit. Because guess what? The farther you are outside of that orbit, the farther you are outside from that orbit, the farther you are in the different relationship. The first orbit is going to have a different relationship. Their behavior is going to be different. Why? Because the gravity, even on the nucleus, the speed that they are in is going to be different. They're actually at higher speed than the distant orbit. You guys know that in chemistry. How many people studied chemistry and they know that in chemistry? You know that in chemistry. The farther the orbit, the slower it is, right? And of course, the slower it is, it would have different characteristics. And that's why the gas, for example, and you would see even on the periodic table of elements, right? When you look at gas, it tends to be faster in losing its characteristics than actually the solids, right? And you look at the solids, they tend to be slower and so forth.
Let's
Right?
be solid.
Let's be solid. And that's why even when we talk about speaking about solids, when you look at diamonds, for example, there's a way to actually test even the solids. Rocks, they would test them based on how capable they are of staying and keeping their shape. That's why diamonds, they happen to be the strongest because you can't streak them in that way. They don't get broken. They don't get smashed easily. They're solid. That's why being a diamond.
Let's be diamond.
Let's be diamond. There you go. Let's be diamond. So in other words, keep that strength and don't easily get affected. And that's why asking to be a solid one is actually seeking to be steadfast. So how do I actually make sure that I'm steadfast? Of course, when we speak about solids, we test them differently. How do we test people is the question. Do we strike them on different things? No, we certainly don't. Do we weigh and see how much they weigh in order to test them? No, we weigh human beings differently. So how do we weigh them? We weigh them based on one. If we look at the orbit, we want to make sure that this person is recognizing that their orbit and their nucleus in life is Allah Almighty. A person that is aware of Allah Almighty is going to be constantly thinking of the Lord Almighty. Thinking of Allah Almighty means they're seeking Islamic knowledge. Because they're seeking, what should I be doing? They're actually seeking it, but seeking it and having a PhD in Islamic studies does not necessarily mean you practice it. That's a different story. So I need to see, are they living what they had learned? You can have somebody with a PhD, but not actually living it. And I've seen this many, many, many times. I must admit, I learned more in how you practice Islam in teaching while I was teaching in Masjid al-Aqsa than the College of Sharia. Because I've really seen the genuinity of these people living Islam. Because learning Islam is different than living it. Speaking about sabr and giving a lecture about sabr, it's not a lecture to give.
Speaking about diet, exercising diet.
There you go. I think she's referring to me right there. Exactly. Speaking about it is different than actually living it. At the end of the day, speaking about Iman is different than tasting Iman. Speaking about sabr, haya, etc. There are certain akhlaq that you really live it to really taste it. People that live it, people that are reminding you. So looking at those orbits in order for me to recognize who is in that orbit, people that are reminding you of the orbit is how you want to test the person that's surrounding you. People that are motivating you to stay within a certain speed, not slow. They're constantly reminding you, remember your Quran today. Remember, this is not a word of, yeah, only religious people do. It's not a word of only religious people. This is every Muslim should do. This is not only religious people, like there are some people that are a group of people somewhere. This is every Muslim. Are these people reminding me of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Are these people bringing me closer to the akhirah? Why closer to the akhirah? Because the orbit is Allah Almighty, and Allah Almighty told you that your essence preceded your existence. Your purpose of life preceded your own life. So make sure you take in the orbit, because if you don't keep with that orbit, you're going to get lost off the orbit. You're going to get yourself off. And it's so easy. So many different forces around you. Now, I'm sure all of you are thinking of yourself in some element on the periodic table. Where am I? Cesium or who knows
We
what?
said diamonds.
Diamonds. Okay, there you go. Is a diamond? The diamond is not actually there.
No.
It's not, because it's a compound. That's a compound.
doing
The
the umrah, if you stay inside and say you keep on doing,
right.
the more you out, slowly you go out of the road.
Exactly. I love it. I
Stay
love it.
inside of the
I love it. I love it. I love how you
And it's
connected it.
easier and shorter.
exactly.
Exa-
Yeah, stay
yeah.
connected because
You stay
are-
connected.
because the way you said the between
Right.
the between the there's no
You know,
not directly
Saeed
connected to the
Hawa, I
Quran.
love that you brought that up. Saeed Hawa, a book that I was so fascinated with. It's actually a Syrian scholar. So to relate with these ladies right there. And he actually wrote in his book, and I was so infatuated with his books. I still am. He actually wrote in comparison, he was like, when you actually compare, speaking about orbits, and he was actually comparing the orbits with around the Hajj, around the Kaaba, and connecting it with the orbits even around the sun, and that everything is actually in an orbit, and that even your Islam should be within orbit. Once you get off orbit, you're going to find yourself really going out of that gravity. And once you get off the gravity, you're going to find yourself out in this outer space, and then you're going to be lost because you won't have a destination. You're going to, it's going to be like, you're going to be basically probably even sucked by a black hole without you recognizing. And that's the same thing. You will be sucked out of the orbit. It's amazing how you actually related it to that and how both are actually within it. And that's why, so what was that? That's the balance of the universe. Absolutely. That's the whole balance of the universe. And that's the same thing even with the balance of us. If you don't actually consider your own center and where and what I should be relating to, you're going to find yourself going off the orbit, and then you're going to get lost. I know all of you right now are, thinking of yourself as a periodic, an element on the periodic table. So at the same time, how do we actually recognize? Well, you recognize it by looking at, seeing those people that actually live the genuine Islam and not making a fake appearance to gain publicity and attraction. How do I actually recognize that? Are they steadfast despite all the different challenges that they have probably come across? And that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to be connected with those salihin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually tell us, well, you yourself, start with yourself. أقم الصلاة طرفي النهار وزلفا من الليل. You yourself, start with yourself in where perform your salah. Why salah? Because salah itself is actually the main connector to keep you connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Throughout the night and throughout the day, make sure you're constantly connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of time, position, and place. Because without this connection, you're going to find yourself definitely getting off track, and without you realizing, you're going to be going way in a different area. So, إن الحسنات يذهبن السيئات. For الحسنات, you may commit different sins, but continue to doing what is good, because the good deeds will actually wipe the bad deeds without you recognizing. ذلك ذكرى للذاكرين. That's for you to remember and for you to constantly create. What does, when you're walking in an orbit, what does it do? You commit something, but what you had committed is actually in the past. So what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell you? There are certain things that you cannot correct in the past, but you can actually create a new path to delete what happened in the past. All right. So now we're going into the orbit again. ذلك ذكرى للذاكرين. واصبر فإن الله لا يضيع أجر المحسنين. Why واصبر? Because you have to take in a certain challenge. What does it mean to actually live الصبر? What does it mean to live the patience? It actually means that you're going to come across certain challenges that will try to pull you out of the orbit. So be careful. You will come across certain challenges, but don't be a person that is easily taken out of it. So what are the challenges? Well, those are the different fitan that can be manipulating. Therefore, remember, you cannot rely on your feelings or your environment to help you recognize the fitan, because they can be manipulating. So what do I need to do? Well, that's why you always need to get that daily education on Islam by reading the Quran and recognizing the Sunnah. And I mean daily, not once a month, not once a week, but every single day. Why? Because every single day you will come across different challenges. Remember, just like in any element, there's the challenge of environment, heat, temperature, striking, all these different things can actually change that element's characteristic. So in order to maintain your shape, you need to make sure that you're constantly aware of the different speeds that surround you. You're constantly aware of the different environments, different temperatures that surround you, because just like any element, you can change without you recognizing. So what do I need to be and what do I need to stay and do in order to stay within that orbit? Well, you need to constantly keep yourself connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through salah, and definitely through education, because that creates, you are different than the elements because you need your mind, despite the fact that it can be manipulating, but you still need your mind to recognize and make those decisions. So that's why we need to educate ourselves on how we too can be prone to fitna. In other words, we need to educate ourselves about ourselves. What does it mean about ourselves? About our nafs. Because we ourselves, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that we love houses, cars, children, money, but those are supposed to be natural. Why is that even considered evil? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not telling you that those are evil, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that yes, they are part of your nature, but you also need to be aware of your own nature that can actually get carried away to only be focused on those elements. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ وَالْبَنِينَ وَالْقَنَاطِيرِ الْمُقَنطَرَةِ. He said, it is beautified for the people, the love of women, children, gold and treasures, from gold and silver and khayl, which today, like cars and all that, and the different an'am and the different animals, etc., that we might have, which today, we might not use the animals, but we will actually use the different types of what we would consider as property and money. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ذَلِكَ مَتَاعُ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. Those are just limited beauties and limited joy that you will find in this life. But you want to keep your focus. وَاللَّهُ عِنْدَهُ حُسْنُ الْمَآبِ. And the Lord Almighty has what is actually way higher and a lot more magnificent than that beauty. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, well, once you recognize the start in where the fitna actually lies, in how you yourself actually have the elements that will make you prone to fitna. You will feel good if a guy looks at you. You will feel good if somebody compliments your clothes. You will feel good if somebody compliments your car, your house. You will feel good because remember, that's how we recognize something's good. That's how we recognize it. So again, we go back to the same point that we left off with before, in where that compliment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, be careful from the compliments, because it can be a place of fitna. It can be a place of manipulation. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, connect yourself constantly with a spiritual connection, in where he said, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ, and perform salah. Why? Because the salah تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر. Because the salah is actually your way to keep you away from the immorality that you may not recognize. And the Prophet ﷺ was actually telling us that there are going to come times, not only places, not only people, but there are even times that they're going to have more challenges than others. And he was talking about his time, but let's look at our time. So he says, بادروا بالأعمال, rush in doing what is good. Why? Because they're going to come at times You're going to come across times where there will be manipulators. Fitnan. What about it? كقطع الليل المظلم. It's going to be just like the dark night. You can't even recognize it. It's going to be so much that you can't even recognize it. Why? In other ahadith, it will explain you will have fake scholars, you will have fake religious people, you will have people that are going to be redefining the definitions, creating new narratives, and without you recognizing, you will think and you will fall an easy victim to those manipulators. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually telling us, in fact, the Prophet ﷺ is telling us, يُصْبِحُ الرَّجُلُ مُؤْمِنًا وَيُمْسِي كَافِرًا, where the person may wake up a believer and sleep as a disbeliever, and wake up as a disbeliever and wake up or sleep as a believer. What happened? The manipulators were so vast that they were affecting people 24/7. So therefore, recognizing what? Recognizing the wealth, recognizing that extravagant itself can actually be a manipulator. We're near to finishing, inshallah. Don't worry, I know you're looking at it and you're like, oh, where are we? All right. Don't worry, inshallah, we're near to finishing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually warned us of living the extravagance, living in luxury, because luxury and extravagance can actually be a place of fitna. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in numerous ayat, said, وَإِذَا أَرَدْنَا أَن نُهْلِكَ قَرْيَةً أَمَرْنَا مُتْرَ فِيهَا. When the Lord Almighty had given the order to destruct a certain city, he would order to destruct, and he explained that they were usually the extravagant ones. أَمَرْنَا مُتْرَ فِيهَا. What happened? Why the ones living in luxury? Because فَفَسَقُوا فِيهَا. Luxury is what led them to actually go off the orbit. So when we look at luxury many times, it is actually seen during our times as a place of compliment. That's what usually in our times, what we're actually trying to get to. We would get an education in order to get money. We would get the money to get compliment. We would get the compliment to make us feel that that is the success that we're trying to get to, that that's the true success. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, be careful, because true success is not about the money. It's redefining how we define success. Be careful, because this is a manipulation in itself, in where you might actually get your children, for example, out of a Quran class because you thought, well, they've got soccer to do. And if they would have soccer, well, I need to fit in the time soccer, because if they were to get extra points and their GPA, and they will get better chance to actually get into university. And once they get into a university, then they might actually get a scholarship. After all, the school won't actually recognize how much Quran that they had learned or how much Islamic studies that they had learned, but they will recognize how much ball they might have done, or how much math and advanced math they had done. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, be careful, redefine what orbit and what success is to you, because be careful from looking at the environment and what they would regard as the success or as what deserves to be complimented. Why luxury? Because when you look at luxury, it can actually get your heart away from thinking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to only thinking of dunya.
There is the page before. Can you explain the Umar ibn al-Khattab?
So Umar ibn al-Khattab was actually saying, اتزروا وارتدوا وانتعلوا وألقوا الخفاف والسراويلات وَأَلْقُوا الرُّكَبَ. So what was he talking about? He was basically saying that was Umar ibn al-Khattab telling the Sahaba and telling the Salihin later that in other words, dress to a limit. And even when you don't wear those extravagant shoes. And alqul khifaf, because it was considered like to wear those type of shoes, it was considered like it was extravagant. So Umar ibn Khattab was telling them, don't dress in the extravagant type of dressing like the kuffar, the Christians and the Jews had. And even for al-rikab, basically the kind, I don't know what it's called. They're basically the things that you would use to go up on the horses, not the saddle. It's basically a certain, it's part of a saddle. You step on it in order to go up on it. All right. So that's what, that's basically Umar al-Khattab was saying. It's like, do it the hard way and live simple. It was basically trying to get that. And even here to actually bil Ma'diya, which basically was referring to a certain tribe that was known to be very simple. And he said, warmul aghrad, leave all the different extravagance and leave the different luxury and even the dress of like the al-ajam. Al-ajam are basically the non-Arab, but he wasn't referring to the non-Arab. He was basically talking about the Christians and the Jews. And he said, stay away from silk, because he was basically recommending a simple lifestyle, because an extravagant lifestyle was going to get you away from your deen. It was going to let you think that such compliments, by taking such compliments, it was taking you into dunya. So Umar al-Khattab was recommending living a simple lifestyle. All right. So why? In order to keep your heart connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, making your focus be on your purpose. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, اعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر. And then what? And then تفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في الأموال والأولاد. Said, and know that life and dunya is all about playing when you're a child, and then entertainment and trying to look good when you're a teenager. And then when you grow a little bit older, it's all about getting the compliments and zina and trying to reveal beauty and all that. And then later when you get older and you start having children, it's all about tafakhurun bainakum. It's all about each one boasting about the different things that they have, probably cars, houses, children, and how much they spent on hotel or whatever it is. And then it's all about increase in wealth and children. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it's just like the different grain and harvest, that the kuffar here is not the kuffar to mean disbelievers, but is actually talking about the farmers. Just like the farmers, they would see the greenery, and then the greenery grows stronger and stronger in their harvest, and then it becomes yellow, and the yellow then later just becomes nothing but sticks. And on Judgment Day, it will just be nothing. This is now going back to the beginning, in where if a person lived a life where in their early childhood, they're just playing, and when in their teenage, they're just here, just really on their phones and just entertaining themselves on Instagram, and then later just entertaining themselves and just now I'm trying to act the other to find a mate, in where I'm trying to beautify myself, and then later trying to just boast about all these things, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, then that person that's living a lifestyle like that, then al-akhirah, they're going to be living a'adhabun shadid. They're going to be living and endure and going through the adhab, the torments of hellfire. Or they could choose a maghfirah min Allah wa ridwan, where they could choose to seek the path of forgiveness and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is content over them. And that's why it's really important. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, he was telling them, I don't feel poverty over you, but I actually fear that the dunya would be easy on you. In other words, to actually have extravagant life, just like those that came before you. And then they would start competing in that. Competing in what? Competing in the luxury, competing in the wealth, competing in those different things that bring them closer to dunya. And then what does it do? It basically will lead to their own destruction. So what does it mean? Be limited in the different food choices. Teach your children how to be limited even in their food choices, whether it's in food, in clothes, in the different luxury. Teach them how to be simple. Teach them how to focus and redefine what deserves to be complimented. What deserves to be complimented and what really deserves to be putting all my effort in. In other words, let them focus even on learning their deen before you even compliment on learning all the different dunya matters. Because the dunya matters, they're going to get them more dunya. It's not bad. We need doctors. We need engineers. We need these people, definitely. But that should not actually be on the expense of their deen. Not at the expense of their deen. Deen comes first. Why? Because it's their orbit. It's their orbit. It's their focus right there in where they would focus on their iman. And that's when they would learn by the training how to focus on La ilaha illallah, how to focus which orbit and who they put within their orbit. And then they would recognize, and you would also live those words, that even when you want to talk about seerah, when you want to talk about story about anybody, make sure that every single day you're taking a moment to talk about either tafsir or about the story of a prophet or story of Salihin, in order for them to recognize that there is an example to live, that they would recognize that that example to live is the example not wanting dunya, but wanting akhirah. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said, whoever leaves the extravagant, whether it's in clothes and all those different things, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, دعاه الله يوم القيامة على رؤوس الخلائق حتى يخيره من أي حلل الإيمان شاء أن يلبسها. On Judgment Day, those that would leave this extravagant life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will actually call them on Judgment Day for them to choose what from the beautification do they choose in Jannah. Why? Because their focus, their orbit was not dunya. Their orbit was Allah. And these people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will actually see their action, and He will actually make them choose what they choose from the akhirah, because they had chosen to give up on all the different extravagance. They want Allah Almighty. And recognizing the blessing actually brings better faith. So even for your children, when you actually teach them, recognize the different blessings that you have. It actually brings them better akhlaq, better morality, and it brings them better principle, and it makes them better, even psychologically better. Because when they actually recognize those things, you could see that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, قد أفلح من أسلم ورزق كفافا وقنعه الله بما أتاه. The ones to be successful. When you look at the word قد أفلح, actually means not just in akhirah, but even in dunya. Why are we increasing in mental illness and depression and all that? Even though all the different tools of dunya have definitely become better. We're getting less people homeless. We're getting more people getting and having food available, education available. But yes, yet we're seeing an increase in mental illness, an increase in depression, anxiety, an increase in suicide rate. And why? Well, the reason, when you look at that, one of the main reasons, not the only reason, Allah, the Prophet ﷺ actually says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ أَسْلَمَ. The ones to really succeed are really the ones to submit to their Lord Almighty. Why? Because they recognize their orbit. They recognize where they're heading, not confused about which destination they're going. وَرُزْقَ كَفَافًا. And they were actually given il-kafaf. What is il-kafaf? Satisfaction. Remember when we started in the beginning, said you can have a home, you can buy a house, but not a home. And that's the same thing. You can have money, but satisfaction is different. You can have money, but satisfaction is something else. You can have all the different, you can have an education, but understanding is different. It's totally different. You can have money, but not necessarily the hospitality. It's different. You can have beauty, but not necessarily the morality. It's something else. It's something else. And that's the same thing. When the Prophet ﷺ was actually said, وَرُزِقَ كَفَافًا, to teach the children, this is enough. You don't need to have. Umar ibn Khattab was telling the Sahaba and teaching them, أَكُلَّمَا اشْتَهَيْتَ اشْتَرَيْتَ. Is it every time that you wanted or you desired something, you have to go get it? If the children feel that every single time that, yes, I want something, I have to go get, then later on, they're going to feel that whenever I'm deprived of something, that means it's the end of the world. It's the end of the world. And then they'll go into anxiety because they didn't get what they wanted. You don't have to get what you want. Because what you want should be focused on akhirah, not dunya. Same thing. ورزق كفافا. Satisfaction is something else. Teach it even to your children, to yourself. وقنعه الله بما أتاه. That's when, once they live in that satisfaction, that's when they actually live it on the inside. They will actually have the content. They will live to be content with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was actually teaching us, من أصبح آمنا في سربه. What are the things that are the most important things that I should be recognizing? One, if you wake up, the Prophet ﷺ says, and you are secure in your stay, you've got the health in your body, you've got the food for your day, you've got everything in dunya. There's no more. There's no more. In other words, if you would think that you're finding and you're in search of absolute satisfaction or absolute happiness, that's all you got. You can't sleep on more than one bed. You just need one bed. You can have all the food, but your stomach can only hold just a little bit. Your home, you can have the biggest home in the world, but you're only, realistically and practically speaking, you're only occupying one small space. At the end of the day, recognizing the ni'mah. If you are secure, you're healthy, you've got the daily food, that's all there is in dunya. To actually think there's more and run after more, you're running after a mirage. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was teaching us, كن في الدنيا كأنك غريب. Be in this life like you're a stranger or habir sabil, or just passing by. Because what's a passing by person? You're just passing by. Yep, that's nice. And walk. Don't necessarily stay there for too long because you weren't created to be in that. So what do we recognize? I love these two ahadith. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, make use of 5 before 5. Make use of your youth before your old age, your health before your illness, your wealth before your poverty, your leisure time before getting busy, your life before death. Recognize these things or else they'll pass and it will be too late. What else? The hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, I absolutely love this hadith. It's a dua. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan wal-ajzi wal-kasal wal-bukhli wal-jubn wa dala'i ad-dayni wa ghalabat al-rijal. I pondered in this dua. So what does he say? Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from sorrow and sadness, from disability and laziness, from bukhul, greed, and cowardness, from the effect of debt, and from the overcoming of men. But I was like, what do these actually have with one another? Whenever you would have two things, in one combination, that they should have a relationship. So I actually found that ilham wal huzn, ilham actually relates to an illness where it's the ramification of, a direct ramification of an illness. So for example, I get in a fight with my husband. I'm actually, I'm feeling the sorrow because I got in a fight with my husband, and the reason why I'm sad is because I basically got in a fight with my husband. But al-hazan is different, in where I got in a fight with my husband, for example, and then even though my husband is not around me, but I'm still feeling from the sadness that I got into yesterday, it still has its effect today. It vibrates.
Depression.
The
Depression.
well, later on, depression. And al-hajz is an actual disability. What does laziness have to do with it? An actual disability, in where a physical disability, you are literally disabled, in where your power to do something is gone. But laziness is different. You've got the power, but you're not using it. You've got the power, but you're not using it. You're being lazy. You're not recognizing the power. So you basically get held back. Al-bukhl, being greedy. You've got the money, but you don't want to use it. Al-jubn, you've got the body, but you don't have the courage on the inside. You've got the body. They've got the power, but they didn't even recognize the courage. That's a different thing. There's a certain morality. You've got the power, but just like this guy, he didn't recognize the money. Didn't recognize the wealth, so he actually lived in greed. And this guy didn't recognize the body power, so they lived in fear, and they were so afraid they didn't even have the courage. And then there's something that overcomes them, in where debt has overcome them. It's money that they couldn't control this challenge. And غلبت الرجال, couldn't control the challenge of the men, and in other words, the people that surround them, and how they can overcome them in power. So when you look at this, there's the physical disability or the psychological disability right there in al-ham wal-huzn, the psychological part of it, and there's the financial part of it, and there's the part and where the moral part of it, which is al-bukhl wal-jubn, it's the moral side, and then the dila' ad-dayn, it's something that is beyond you. You see the relationship? Psychological, ilham wal-huzn or al-hazan, al-ajz, physical, al-bukhl wal-jubn, it's basically an inner morality, and then this is something that is beyond you. And there is another beautiful, so right there in another beautiful dua where the Prophet ﷺ actually used to make the dua. And the dua, Allahumma inni as'aluka fi'la al-khayrat. Ya Allah, I ask you to grant me the ability to do what is good. Wa tark al-munkarat, and to leave what is wrong. Wa hubb al-masakin, and to love the needy. If you look at these, hubb al-khayrat, fi'l al-khayrat, to do what is good, because you can know what is good but not do it. Tark al-munkarat, you can know what is bad and not do it, and do it. Wa hubb al-masakin, and loving the masakin. Why loving al-masakin? Because once you build a connection with the needy, that's when you will build the connection with akhirah, not dunya. Let's reread and flip the dua. Flip the dua. حب المساكين. What's the opposite of حب المساكين? If حب المساكين brings you to آخرة, what's the opposite of مساكين? Maryam is sleeping. Was I boring you guys? Richness. So loving the rich brings you to dunya. You see it? If loving masakin brings you to akhirah, then loving the rich brings you to dunya. You see, are you with me, you guys? So what are we connecting ourselves with? We're connecting ourselves.
I'm sorry, how many?
We're finished.
Yeah.
Yep, we're finished. How do we protect ourselves? Connect yourself with the masjid. إنما يعمر مساجد الله من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر. How do I connect myself? Connect yourself with the masajid. Connect yourself with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Connect yourself with dua. Allahumma aslih li dini alladhi huwa ismatu amri. Ya Allah, let my deen be my main focus because that is the main focus. Wa aslih li dunyaya allati fiha ma'ashi. Ya Allah, and let my dunya, the life that I live, be in stability. And let وَأَصْلِحْ لِي آخِرَتِي الَّتِي فِيهَا مَعَادِي. And let me, my akhirah, be also in piety, because that's what my return will be. وَاجْعَلِ الْحَيَاةَ زِيَادَةً لَنَا فِي كُلِّ خَيْرٍ. And let this life that we live be an increase for every good deed. And death be a rest from every evil thing. So when we connect with that, we're basically rejuvenating our spirituality, connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by bringing in khawf al-maqam, and we're bringing in our final one. Ya Allah, Ya Hayyu Ya Qayyum, to make the dua right there. Do it again. Allahumma aslih lana dinana, alladhi huwa ismatu amrina. وأصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا وأصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا واجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير واجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر. Ya Allah, we just translated this one. Oh Allah, make us from those that will see what is truth as truth, and what those that will see what is evil as evil, and make us from those that will do and follow truth, and make us from those that will stay away from evil, and make us from those that will hold on to haqq, and make our path be from with those that are always doing what is haqq. Ya Allah, make our children amongst the guided ones, and make us from the guided ones. وَجَعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا, and make us role models to guide others as well. Ya Allah, make us from those that have light in their eyes and light in their ears and light above them, and make us from those that will have light on their right and light on their left, and light in their hearts and light in their tongues, and make us from those that speak in light. Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. Ya Allah, make us from those that will always gather in truth and guide, and make us from those that will always gather in haqq, and make us from those that will always be from those that do tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bil sabr, that support one another in following guidance and being on patience. Allahumma ameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira. I hope Allah yahfadhku ya Rabbi. Sorry if I was boring. I hope I didn't go into circles. I hope I didn't go into circles. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer any question. It is recorded. So if those that want to see the recording, it is recorded. Any questions before I let you guys go? Go ahead, my dear.
I
Azza.
have a question.
Mhm.
Actually, it's واتقوا فتنة لا تصيبن الذين ظلموا منكم خاصة.
Mhm.
For sure, Allah is not injustice. We cannot say that. But how can you avoid this? Sometimes I look like what's happening in like my country, or you see that there is a group of people who did fitna, but innocent people paid off for it. How does it come together? How can you avoid it?
So there are a number of different things. In the end, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when there are people that basically were part of the harm and the evil, that let's call it the ramifications of evil that harmed those that deserved the harm, and then you end up, for example, paying the price. All right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not create absolute evil, only humans do. So when somebody is, let's call it a victim, or happens to be among those that were affected by the evils that surround them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will compensate them. And that's why in the ayah, وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا, and whoever was killed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا, then we will give to their guardians a power. And then he says, فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ, so do not abuse the power. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that he will grant you a compensation that is far exceeding what you might actually expect. So do not abuse it. So whether we're talking about the many victims in Syria, or whether we're talking about the many victims out there in the world, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never whatsoever leave these people be as a result of a punishment of only what the other people have done, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will actually compensate the victims that actually had the power or had actually put in an effort to make a change. But we still have to put in the effort to make a change. So in other words, when you look at the story of Bani Israel, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the story of 3 different people. One group that did not order for what is good. We've got a group that was doing what is wrong. 3 groups. One was not ordering to make a change to the wronghood. In other words, they were totally content with it. They just let them do it. The second group, they were actually ordering for what is good. The third group told the second group, you're wasting your time. They're not going to change. The second group responded, مَعْذِرَةً إِلَىٰ رَبِّكُمْ. It's just an excuse in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ. Maybe they'll change. But what was the reason? They recognized that they might not change ever. But the reason why they order for what is good is مَعْذِرَةً إِلَىٰ رَبِّكُمْ, is really just an excuse in the eyes to be in front of the Lord Almighty that we did what we can. When a punishment does come, what happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that all the people got punished except the second group. Might they have been amongst the atrocities if there would be a government to see how many people were killed? Might have been probably amongst the atrocities that were put in with the statistic. They might have been. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us that he will compensate and give them power. You never recognize what power they're granted. And right now we're seeing amongst, for example, the things that we see on social media. A Syrian girl in Germany probably got the highest GPA in all over Germany. Another Syrian girl got this power. Another Syrian boy actually managed to win in some kind of a challenge in making robots. Another Syrian. While all of a sudden Syrians actually coming up, all of a sudden, whether it's Syrians or Pakistanis or whatever it is, but why all of a sudden Syrians actually coming up right now, all of a sudden that they just were recognized? No, it actually comes with the same default of the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that his punishment over any group of people will not come without giving justice to those that did not deserve it. You see what I'm saying?
Maybe it's in the akhirah. But
Even in dunya, my dear. No, the ayah was talking about in dunya, not the akhirah.
every single one you think will be
In
compensated
dunya,
in
absolutely, absolutely. Every single person, if they face an evil, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told you that there is a law that he put, and we're talking about dunya. He said, فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا. That this is actually talking about dunya, not akhirah. In akhirah, that's a different story. He was talking about dunya. And that's why, what's the evidence? He said, فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. Then don't abuse that power. This is talking about dunya, not akhirah. So if you are abused, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, don't live the trauma, and know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you a power and will give you some type of an authority. Don't let the trauma overcome you, and live the power. So Islam was redirecting your vision from seeing the trauma to seeing the power, from seeing an illness to seeing healing, from seeing oppression to seeing victory. Islam is redirecting the way you view things. How? By telling you Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one, له مقاليد السماوات والأرض. He controls all the matters, not only the laws of physics, but he even controls the laws that what happens to the decree of people, what happens to qadar. So if that woman is divorced, for example, and her husband abused her, maybe he managed to take away the children, maybe he managed this, but he doesn't know that it will snap to them. Any person that commits any sin, it will snap and it will come back to your face. There's no way. That's the law of the Lord Almighty. It will snap. In dunya, before even the akhirah, it will snap. Never does the Lord Almighty actually punish victims like that. Nope, hatta al-kafir, even a kafir. Why? Because the Lord Almighty is most just. Wasama, I said to Muhammad, sorry.
Yeah.
We
You can start with it. Yeah.
absolutely. Part of his mercy and part of his justice. Part of his justice and mercy. And that's why when we actually recognize that, it's living the names and attributes of the Lord Almighty. It's living the attributes and the names of the Lord Almighty, where we recognize Allah Almighty and we recognize the words of Allah Almighty. All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. You know, I forgot about it.